What if the very thing that made you an outcast held the key to saving not just your world, but countless others? What if the curse you bore in silence was actually humanity's greatest gift to the universe? In the remote village of Thornwick, where ancient stones whisper secrets and the forest holds memories older than civilization, one woman's burden becomes the catalyst for an extraordinary revelation. When Lyra awakens, speaking words that predate known history, she doesn't just unlock humanity's forgotten past. She discovers why Earth's children were scattered among the stars, and what terrible responsibility they were meant to carry. This is not just a story of survival. This is the tale of how one cursed woman became the bridge between worlds, the keeper of cosmic balance, and the proof that humanity's greatest strength has always been its willingness to sacrifice for others, even when those others have long forgotten who saved them. Prepare to discover why humans are truly the galaxy's most feared and respected guardians, and why some curses are actually the universe's greatest blessings in disguise. The morning mist clung to Thornwick Village like the breath of sleeping giants, and Lyra Ashwood moved through it like a ghost among the living. Her bare feet made no sound on the cobblestones as she made her way to the well, a wooden bucket clutched in hands that trembled not from cold, but from the dreams that still echoed in her mind. She had been dreaming in colors that had no names again. The villagers gave her a wide berth as always, crossing themselves and muttering prayers under their breath. Children peeked at her from behind their mother's skirts, wide eyes filled with the kind of fascination reserved for dangerous things. Lyra kept her gaze downcast, her long black hair hanging like a curtain between herself and their stares. Cursed, they whispered, touched by darkness. If only they knew how right they were, and how wrong. The curse had manifested when Lyra turned 16, 3 years ago now. It started with the dreams, visions of places that couldn't exist, of people with skin like starlight, and eyes that held the depth of eternity. Then came the episodes where she would speak in tongues that made the village priest weep, and the oldest inhabitants locked their doors and refused to emerge until dawn. But this morning was different. This morning, when Lyra had awakened, the words that spilled from her lips weren't the usual incomprehensible syllables that sent shivers down spines and made dogs howl. This morning, she had understood every single word she spoke, and the understanding terrified her more than any curse ever could. The watchers stir, she had whispered to her empty cottage. The barriers weaken. The children of Earth must remember what they were born to guard. The words had felt ancient on her tongue, carved from stone and starfire, and they had brought with them a flood of images that made her previous visions seem like pale shadows. She had seen worlds burning, not with fire, but with a darkness that consumed light itself. She had seen creatures of impossible geometry and malevolent intelligence pressing against invisible barriers, testing, probing, waiting. And she had seen humans, not the simple villagers of Thornwick, but humans as they were meant to be, warriors of will and spirit, standing sentinel at the edges of reality, their very presence a bulwark against things that should never exist. Now, as she drew water from the village well, Lyra caught her reflection in its dark surface. The face that stared back at her was pale and hollow-cheeked, marked by sleepless nights and the weight of carrying something too large for any one person to bear. But her eyes held depths that hadn't been there yesterday, as if overnight she had gained the vision to see across vast distances of space and time. "You're up early, child." Lyra's head snapped up to find Elder Tommen approaching, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that came from a lifetime of watching over others. Of all the villagers, only Tommen had never feared her, never crossed himself in her presence. He claimed it was because he was too old and stubborn to believe in curses, but Lyra had always suspected there was more to it than that. "The dreams woke me," she said quietly, lifting the bucket from the well. Water sloshed over the sides, and she noticed her hands were shaking again. Tommen studied her with eyes that seemed far too knowing for a simple village elder. "Different dreams?" Lyra nodded, not trusting herself to speak. How could she explain that her dreams had transformed from chaotic nightmares into something that felt more like memories? How could she tell him that she was beginning to remember things she had never learned, understand languages she had never heard? "Walk with me," Tommen said softly, and there was something in his voice that made it less of a request and more of a gentle command. They moved through the village in comfortable silence, past the baker's shop where warm bread scented the air, past the blacksmith's forge where sparks danced like tiny stars. The normalcy of it all seemed strange to Lyra now, like a play being performed for an audience that didn't realize they were watching a carefully constructed illusion. Tom Min led her to the edge of the village, where ancient standing stones marked the boundary between civilization and the wild forest beyond. The stones were older than Thornwick itself, carved with symbols that scholars had puzzled over for generations without success. Local legend claimed they were protection wards, though no one remembered what they were meant to protect against. "Tell me about your dreams, child," Tom Min said, settling himself onto a fallen log with the careful movements of age. "All of them." Lyra remained standing, her gaze fixed on the strange symbols carved into the nearest stone. For the first time in her life, they almost seemed familiar, as if she had seen them before in some half-remembered context. "You'll think I've gone mad," she whispered. "I'm old enough to know that madness and truth often wear the same face," Tom Min replied. "Speak freely." So Lyra spoke. She told him about the dreams of burning worlds and impossible creatures, about the visions of humans who stood guard against things that defied comprehension. She told him about waking up speaking words in a language that felt older than memory, and about the growing certainty that these weren't dreams at all, but something far more significant. "This morning," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind through the trees, "I remembered something that never happened to me. I remembered standing on a world under 3 purple suns, watching a horizon that curved the wrong way. There were others with me, humans, but not like any I've ever seen. They were stronger, taller, and their eyes held a kind of fire that spoke of battles fought across impossible distances." She turned to face Tom Min and was startled to see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "And one of them spoke to me," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "A woman with silver hair and scars across her hands. She said, 'The gift passes to the next guardian. Remember what we fought to preserve. Remember why humanity scattered to the stars.' And then she touched my forehead, and I felt something vast and ancient settle into my mind like a key finding its lock." Tom Min was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the standing stones with an intensity that made Lyra's skin prickle with unease. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to age him even further. "Lyra," he said slowly, "what do you know of your family history?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Lyra frowned. "You know as much as I do. My parents died when I was small in the plague. You and the village raised me." "Your parents weren't from Thornwick originally," Tom Min said, and there was something careful in his tone, as if he were testing the waters. "They came here shortly before you were born, carrying very little, but speaking of having traveled a great distance. Your mother was unusual. She had dreams too, though she was better at hiding them." Lyra felt the world shift beneath her feet, as if reality had suddenly revealed itself to be far less stable than she had believed. "You never told me this. I thought the knowledge had died with them," Tom Min said softly. "But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps some knowledge is too important to stay buried." He rose from a log with effort and approached the nearest standing stone, placing his weathered hand against its carved surface. "These stones weren't placed here by our ancestors, Lyra. They were already ancient when the first humans settled in this valley. But your mother seemed to understand them. She would come here during her pregnancy, placing her hands on them just as I'm doing now, and she would speak in the same tongue that spilled from your lips during your episodes." Lyra's heart was racing now. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed beginning to form a picture that both terrified and amazed her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that perhaps your curse isn't a curse at all," Tom Min said, turning to face her with eyes that held a mixture of fear and hope. "Perhaps it's an inheritance. Perhaps you're remembering not dreams, but the true history of your people." Before Lyra could respond, a sound echoed across the valley that made both of them freeze. It was a deep, resonant humming that seemed to come from the stones themselves, a vibration that felt more felt than heard. The carved symbols began to glow with a faint blue light, and the air around them shimmered like heat waves rising from summer stones. "It's happening," Lyra whispered, and she realized she understood what it was without being told. "They're coming." "Who's coming?" Tommen asked, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. Lyra's vision was changing, overlaying the familiar landscape of Thornwick with something else entirely. She could see the village as it truly was, not just a collection of simple buildings, but a carefully placed anchor point, a beacon calling across the vast darkness between stars. The standing stones weren't protection wards. They were navigation markers, guiding something home after an impossibly long journey. "The first ship will arrive at sunset," she said, and the certainty of it filled her voice with an authority that made Tommen step back in surprise. "The crew has been traveling for 3 generations, following signals that led them here. They carry refugees from a dozen dying worlds, and they're being pursued by something that feeds on civilizations." The glow from the stones was growing brighter, and Lyra could feel something vast awakening in her mind, like a library of knowledge that had been locked away and was now throwing open its doors. She understood now why she had been born in this small village, why her parents had traveled so far to reach this specific place, why she had spent 19 years of her life feeling like a stranger in her own skin. "I'm not cursed," she breathed, and the realization brought with it a joy so pure it made her want to weep. "I'm a guardian. One of the last, maybe the only one left on Earth, but still a guardian." Tommen was staring at her with wide eyes, and she could see him struggling to process what was happening. "Guardian of what?" "Of the barriers," Lyra said, turning to look at the forest beyond the stones. But it wasn't really a forest anymore, was it? It was a dimensional fold, a place where reality bent in on itself to create a hidden sanctuary. "Of the knowledge. Of the refugees who've been scattered across 1,000 worlds, waiting for the signal to come home." The humming was growing louder now, and other sounds were beginning to join it. Sounds like distant thunder and rushing wind, like the whisper of vast wings moving through space. The villagers would be hearing it soon, and they would be afraid, just as humans had always been afraid of things they didn't understand. But Lyra was no longer afraid. For the first time in her life, she felt complete, like a sword that had finally found its proper wielder. The memories were flooding back now, not just her own, but those of every guardian who had come before her, stretching back through generations to the first humans who had looked up at the stars and chosen to step into the darkness to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "There's so much you don't know," she said to Tommen, her voice filled with a sadness that came from understanding the full scope of what had been lost. "About what humanity really is, about why we spread across the galaxy, about the war we've been fighting for longer than recorded history." She placed her hand on the same stone Tommen had touched, and felt the ancient technology within it respond to her presence like a flower turning toward the sun. The standing stones of Thornwick were more than markers. They were part of a vast network that stretched across space and time, connecting every world where humanity had made its mark, allowing the scattered children of Earth to find each other across the cosmic dark. "But they're coming home now," she continued, and her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "The lost fleets, the forgotten colonies, the survivors of worlds that fell to things that shouldn't exist. They've been following the network home for generations, and tonight the first of them arrives here." The blue light was spreading now, flowing from stone to stone like liquid starlight, and Lyra could feel the barrier between dimensions growing thin. Soon, very soon, the first ship would break through, carrying refugees who had traveled further and suffered more than any human should have to endure. And they would look to her for guidance, for protection, for the wisdom that only a guardian could provide. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a calm certainty that felt as natural as breathing. She was Lyra Ashwood, the cursed woman of Thornwick, and she had just remembered that she was also something far more important. She was humanity's last guardian on Earth, the keeper of ancient knowledge and the protector of the lost. The real story was only just beginning. The ship that materialized above Thornwick as the sun touched the horizon was nothing like the vessels from human history books. It was vast and organic-looking, its hull flowing in curves that suggested it had been grown rather than built. Crystalline formations jutted from its surface like frozen lightning, and along its length, symbols similar to those on the standing stones pulsed with the same blue radiance that now bathed the entire valley. Lyra stood in the village square, no longer the frightened outcast who had drawn water from the well that morning. The knowledge flowing through her mind had transformed her posture, her bearing. even the way she breathed. She was still physically the same young woman, but something fundamental had changed in her core, as if a sleeping giant had awakened within her soul. The villagers had gathered around her in a rough circle, their faces a mixture of terror and desperate hope. When the impossible had begun manifesting above their homes, their first instinct had been to run. But something about Lyra's presence, the calm authority radiating from her like heat from a forge, had drawn them back. Even those who had crossed themselves at the sight of her for years now looked to her for answers. "What is that thing?" asked Marina, the baker's wife, her voice barely above a whisper. She clutched her young son close to her side, the boy's wide eyes reflecting the alien light from above. "It's a sanctuary ship," Lyra replied, and the words came easily, as if she had always known them. "Designed to carry survivors across vast distances while protecting them from the things that hunt in the deep void." Elder Tom Min stepped closer, his weathered face creased with wonder and worry. "How many are aboard?" Lyra closed her eyes and felt her consciousness expand, touching the ship with senses she hadn't possessed hours earlier. She could feel the life aboard the vessel like pinpricks of warmth against her awareness. Thousands of them, some human, others not quite human anymore, but still recognizably descended from Earth's children. 43,000, she said softly. Refugees from 17 different worlds. They've been traveling for 62 years, following the Beacon network home. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. 43,000 people was more than lived in the entire region, and the implications of their arrival were staggering. "Where will they go?" asked Henrik, the village constable, his hand resting unconsciously on his sword hilt. "We can't house that many people. We don't have the resources to feed them." "They're not staying here," Lyra said, opening her eyes to reveal irises that now held flecks of the same blue light emanating from the stones. "Thornwick is a way station, a gathering point. They'll rest here while we prepare for the next phase." "Next phase of what?" Tommen asked. Before Lyra could answer, a beam of soft light descended from the ship, and within it, figures began to materialize. The villagers instinctively drew back, but Lyra stepped forward, her face upturned to receive the arrivals. The first to fully materialize was a woman who could have been anywhere from 30 to 300 years old. She was tall and lean, her silver hair braided with what looked like strands of living light. Her skin had the pale, almost translucent quality of someone who had spent decades away from natural sunlight, but her eyes burned with an inner fire that spoke of a forged in unimaginable crucibles. Behind her came others, men and women bearing the marks of long travel and longer struggles. Some looked entirely human, while others showed subtle changes that suggested adaptation to alien environments. A few bore scars that seemed to shift and move in the light, and one man's left arm had been replaced with something that was clearly not of Earth origin, though it moved with natural grace. "Guardian," the silver-haired woman said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the standing stones resonate in sympathy. She approached Lyra with steady steps, then knelt before her in a gesture that was both reverent and desperate. "We have carried our burden across the void. We seek sanctuary and guidance." Lyra felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders like a familiar cloak. The memories flowing through her mind provided context for this moment. Protocols established long ago, when humanity first spread to the stars and established the Guardian Network to protect the scattered colonies from things that lurked in the spaces between spaces. "Rise, Fleet Commander," she said, and though she had never held such authority before, the words came naturally. "You are welcome here, and your people are under my protection. Report your status." The woman stood, her eyes never leaving Lyra's face. There was relief there and gratitude, but also a bone-deep weariness that spoke of horrors witnessed and prices paid. "I am Commander Zaranash of the colony fleet Prometheus," she said formally. "We are the survivors of the Kepler 442 system, evacuated before the Void Touched could complete their consumption of our worlds. 17 different colonies joined our exodus, and we have spent 62 standard years following the Beacon network toward Earth." Lyra nodded, though the casual mention of such an impossible journey sent shivers down her spine. 62 years. Entire generations have been born and died aboard that ship, never seeing a planet's surface, never breathing unrecycled air. "The void touched," she said, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Ancient memories stirred, showing her glimpses of things that should not exist, entities of pure entropy and hunger that existed in the spaces between dimensions, feeding on the life force of entire civilizations. "Are they still pursuing you?" Commander Nash's expression darkened. 3 days behind us at most. They've grown stronger since we last encountered them, more focused. They're not just consuming randomly anymore. They're hunting specifically for us, for the knowledge we carry. The villagers were listening to this exchange with growing alarm, and Lyra could feel their fear like a cold wind across her awareness. She turned to address them, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "I know this is beyond anything you've experienced," she said, and her tone was gentle but firm, "but you're not in immediate danger. The defenses around Thornwick are stronger than they appear, and there are protocols in place to protect non-combatants." "Non-combatants?" Henrik asked sharply. "Are you saying there's going to be a fight?" Lyra met his gaze steadily. "I'm saying there has always been a fight. You've simply been living in a place where others bore that burden for you." She turned back to Commander Nash, her expression becoming more businesslike. "How long until the void touched arrive?" 72 hours, by our calculations," Nash replied. "Possibly less if they found a way to increase their dimensional transit speed. Then, we have work to do." Lyra looked up at the ship hanging in the darkening sky like a second moon. "Begin evacuating your people to the surface. Priority to children, elderly, and wounded. Use the forest clearing beyond the standing stones. It's larger than it appears from the outside." Nash nodded and began speaking into a communication device that seemed to be integrated into her wrist. Almost immediately, more beams of light descended from the ship, and figures began materializing throughout the village. Lyra watched the arrivals with eyes that saw more than human sight should allow. Each refugee carried within them a piece of humanity's scattered heritage. Languages evolve in isolation, technologies adapted to alien environments, stories of survival against impossible odds. They were the proof of humanity's greatest strength and greatest weakness, their inability to simply stay safe when others needed protection. "Guardian," Tom Min said quietly, approaching her with careful steps. "What do you need from us?" The question made Lyra smile, the first genuine expression of joy she'd worn in years. Here was the heart of it. Even faced with the incomprehensible, the people of Thornwick were asking how they could help rather than how they could flee. "Shelter," she said simply. "Food. Comfort for those who have traveled farther than anyone should have to travel. And trust that when the time comes to make hard choices, I'll make the right ones." Over the next few hours, the village of Thornwick transformed into something unprecedented in its 1,000-year history. The refugees from the Prometheus were unlike anything the villagers had ever encountered, yet they were unmistakably human in all the ways that mattered. They helped with their own evacuation, organized themselves into efficient groups, and despite their exhaustion and the trauma of their long journey, they shared their stories with quiet dignity. Lyra found herself moving through it all like a conductor, directing an impossibly complex symphony. The Guardian knowledge flowed through her consciousness, providing information about refugee management, dimensional defense protocols, and the capabilities of both their allies and their enemies. She coordinated the placement of temporary shelters, ensured that the most vulnerable refugees received priority care, and began the process of activating defenses that had lain dormant for generations. But it was the individual encounters that affected her most deeply. A child who had been born in space and was seeing her first real sky. An elderly man who wept openly at the feel of grass beneath his feet. A woman who had lost her entire family to the void touched and now carried their memories like sacred relics. They're not just running, she realized as she spoke with Commander Nash in the early morning hours. They're preserving something. All of them. Nash nodded, her expression grave. Every colony that fell, every world that was consumed, we saved what we could of their knowledge, their culture, their genetic heritage. The Prometheus isn't just a refugee ship. It's a living archive of 17 human civilizations. The magnitude of that statement hit Lyra like a physical blow. 17 entire civilizations, reduced to the 43,000 survivors now scattered throughout Thornwick and the surrounding forest. 17 worlds worth of art, literature, scientific advancement, and human achievement carried in the minds and genetic codes of exhausted refugees. That's why the void touched are hunting you specifically, she said, understanding flooding through her. It's not just about feeding anymore. They want to erase every trace of those civilizations to make it as if they never existed at all. Extinction by elimination of memory, Nash confirmed. They've learned that destroying the physical worlds isn't enough. As long as someone remembers, as long as the cultural DNA survives, those civilizations can potentially rise again. So now they hunt the survivors, the archives, the keepers of knowledge. Lyra felt a cold rage building in her chest, fueled by memories of countless other Guardian encounters with the void touched over the millennia. This was their true evil, not just destruction, but the erasure of meaning itself. They wanted to reduce the universe to empty silence, devoid of growth, change, or the spark of consciousness that gave life its purpose. Well, she said, her voice carrying an edge that made several nearby refugees look up in surprise, they've made a mistake coming here. Nash studied her with eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. You're very young to be a Guardian, if you don't mind me saying so. Most of the ones we encountered during our journey were ancient, with centuries of experience. I'm the only one left on Earth, Lyra admitted. The Guardian network here has been dormant for generations. I only awakened to my true nature this morning. The admission should have been terrifying for both of them. A barely awakened Guardian facing down cosmic horrors that had destroyed 17 civilizations. Instead, Nash smiled, and it was the first time Lyra had seen her expression lighten since her arrival. Do you know what the other Guardians called Earth in the old days? Nash asked. Lyra shook her head. The Forge, Nash said softly, because Earth's Guardians weren't born powerful, like those from some of the older colonies. Earth's Guardians became powerful through necessity, through the willingness to stand against impossible odds with nothing but determination and the refusal to surrender. She gestured toward the village, where humans from 17 different worlds were finding shelter and comfort among people who had never traveled beyond their valley. Look around you, Nash continued. Your villagers didn't run when faced with the impossible. They asked how they could help. That's the Earth spirit, the thing that made humanity spread to the stars in the first place. The void touched have consumed worlds full of beings with technology beyond our wildest dreams, but they've never faced anything quite like an Earth Guardian defending their home. Lyra felt strength flowing through her, not from the ancient knowledge in her mind, but from something deeper, the recognition of who she was and who her people were. Humans had never been the strongest or the fastest or the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy. But they had been the ones who looked at the darkness between the stars and said someone needs to stand guard, and then actually done it. 72 hours, she said, looking up at the Prometheus hanging in the sky like a promise and a challenge. 72 hours, Nash agreed. The battle for everything humanity had ever accomplished was about to begin. The changes began at dawn on the second day, starting with the standing stones. Lyra had been awake for nearly 36 hours, coordinating the settlement of refugees and preparing defenses that existed more in ancient theory than current practice. She was standing beside the largest of the stone monoliths, her hand pressed against its carved surface, when she felt something vast stirring deep beneath the earth. The sensation was like feeling the slow awakening of a sleeping titan, something so immense that its mere existence reshaped the world around it. The stone beneath her palm began to warm, and the carved symbols flared with light so bright that several nearby refugees cried out in alarm. Guardian, Commander Nash said urgently, approaching at a run. What's happening? Lyra didn't answer immediately. Her consciousness was expanding again, but this time it wasn't just reaching outward toward the stars. It was reaching downward, deep into the earth beneath Thornwick, touching systems and structures that had been waiting in silence for millennia. The ancient network, she breathed, wonder filling her voice. It's still here. All of it. The knowledge flowing through her mind provided context that made her gasp with amazement and terror in equal measure. Thornwick hadn't been chosen as a way station by accident. The village had been built atop one of Earth's primary Guardian installations, a vast complex that extended deep into the planet's core. When humanity had first spread to the stars, they had left behind a network of such installations, each one designed to serve as a final sanctuary if the worst should ever come to pass. For over 1,000 years, the installation beneath Thornwick had waited in dormancy, its incredible systems powered down, but intact, ready to awaken at a guardian's call. Now, responding to Lyra's presence and the approaching threat, it was finally stirring to life. The ground began to vibrate with a deep, harmonic resonance, and across the valley, more standing stones began to illuminate. But these weren't the simple markers the villagers had always known them to be. They were access points, communication arrays, and sensor nodes for a defensive system that spanned the entire region. "Everyone needs to step back from the stones," Lyra called out, her voice carrying clearly across the settlement. The awakening process can be dangerous to anyone without guardian protections. As the refugees and villagers moved to safer distances, the transformation accelerated. The earth around each standing stone began to shift and reshape itself, revealing metallic surfaces that gleamed with their own inner light. Ancient technologies emerged from hiding places that had been sealed since before recorded history, rising from the ground like flowers blooming in fast motion. "My God," Nash whispered, staring in awe as a crystalline spire erupted from the earth near the village well, its faceted surface alive with flowing patterns of energy. "We had legends about the old earth installations, but we thought they were myths." "Not myths," Lyra said, her attention split between the conversation and the flood of system data now flowing through her consciousness. "Contingencies." The first Guardians knew that someday the network might need to be rebuilt from the ground up. They left the tools to do it. More structures were emerging now, each one a masterpiece of technology, so advanced it seemed like magic to those witnessing it. A defensive tower materialized from what had been an empty field, its surface covered in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. A series of smaller installations sprouted around the village perimeter, each one humming with contained power that made the air itself feel electric. But the most dramatic change was happening to the forest itself. The trees were growing visibly and rapidly, their trunks expanding and their canopies spreading to create what was clearly a living fortification. Vines thick as a man's torso burst from the ground and wove themselves into complex patterns between the tree trunks, while thorns the size of sword blades sprouted along their length. "The forest is alive," gasped Marina, the baker's wife, clutching her son close as they watched ancient oaks become towering guardians in the space of minutes. "It's actually alive." "It always was," Lyra replied, understanding flooding through her as the installation's biological systems came online. The Guardians didn't just use technology to defend the waypoints. They used everything, matter, energy, and life itself, all working in harmony. The awakening continued for hours, reshaping not just the physical landscape, but the very nature of the space around Thornwick. Dimensional pockets opened, creating storage areas and defensive positions that existed slightly outside normal reality. The stream that ran through the village expanded into a network of channels that carried not just water, but liquid energy, feeding the growing defensive network. Through it all, Lyra stood at the center of the transformation, her consciousness expanded to encompass and direct the entire process. The ancient installation's control systems had integrated with her mind so completely that she couldn't tell where her thoughts ended and the machine intelligence began. She was simultaneously herself and something far greater, a human woman and the avatar of humanity's collective will to survive. "The refugees," she said suddenly, her attention snapping back to the immediate situation. "Are they safe?" "The transformation energies, we're fine," Commander Nash assured her. "Better than fine, actually. Look." Lyra followed Nash's gaze and saw something that made her heart skip with joy and amazement. The refugees weren't just enduring the transformation. They were being healed by it. Scars that spoke of decades of hardship were fading. Exhaustion that had seemed bone-deep was lifting, and several people who had been bearing obvious injuries were standing straighter and moving with renewed strength. The installation recognizes them as part of the human genetic archive, Lyra realized. It's not just awakening defenses, it's restoring what was damaged. One of the refugees, an elderly man who had been moving with the careful gait of someone nursing broken bones, was now walking normally for the first time in months. A young woman whose eyes had been clouded with radiation damage was blinking in wonder at her restored vision. Children who had been born in the artificial environment of the ship were laughing as they discovered that breathing natural air enriched by the installation's biofilters was like drinking starlight. But not every change was purely beneficial. Lyra could feel the installation's defensive systems coming online, and they were designed for threats far more serious than anything the people of Thornwick had ever encountered. Energy weapon emplacements that could crack mountains were rising from concealed positions. Barrier generators capable of withstanding cosmic forces were spinning up to operational readiness. Detection arrays that could track threats across interstellar distances were extending their influence outward like invisible hands. "How long until the void touch arrive?" she asked Nash. 36 hours, at most, the commander replied, consulting her wrist display. "Possibly less. They've been accelerating their approach." Lyra nodded grimly. The awakening of the installation would not go unnoticed. The energy signature alone would be detectable from light years away, and the void touched would recognize it for what it was, a challenge and a declaration of war. "Then, we need to prepare the people," she said. "Not just for battle, but for what battle against the void touched really means." She turned to address the growing crowd of villagers and refugees who had gathered to witness the transformation. When she spoke, her voice was amplified by the installation's communication systems, ensuring that everyone present could hear her clearly. "You need to understand what we're facing," she said, her tone serious but not despairing. "The void touched aren't just another hostile species. They're the antithesis of life itself. Creatures that exist to unmake everything that grows, changes, or dreams. When they arrive, they won't just attack our bodies, they'll attack our minds, our memories, our very sense of who we are." A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd, but no one fled. These were people who had already faced the unthinkable and survived. They weren't easily broken by the prospect of facing it again. But Lyra continued, her voice gaining strength. "You also need to understand what you are. Each of you carries within you the genetic and cultural heritage of humanity. Not just Earth humanity, but the accumulated wisdom of every human civilization that has ever existed. You are living libraries, walking archives, breathing proof that consciousness can survive and thrive even in the darkest corners of the universe." She gestured toward the transformed landscape around them, where ancient technology and living defenses worked in harmony to create something that was both a fortress and a garden. "This installation was built to protect that heritage," she said. "But more than that, it was built to ensure that no matter what happens, no matter what forces array themselves against us, there will always be a place where humanity can gather its strength and remember who it truly is." Elder Tom Min stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face creased with a mixture of fear and determination that spoke of a lifetime spent making hard choices. "What do you need us to do, Guardian?" he asked simply. The question hung in the air like a bridge between the ordinary world the villagers had known and the cosmic struggle they were about to join. Lyra looked around at the faces surrounding her, humans from 17 different worlds, united by circumstance and choice, ready to stand against an enemy that had consumed entire civilizations. "I need you to remember," she said softly. "Remember every story your grandparents told you, every song that made you feel proud to be human, every moment when you chose kindness over cruelty, hope over despair. The void touched feed on forgetting, on the erosion of meaning and connection. Your memories, your love for each other, your stubborn refusal to surrender. These are weapons more powerful than any energy beam or particle cannon." She paused, letting that sink in, then continued with growing intensity. "And I need you to trust me," she said. "In the hours to come, you're going to see things that challenge everything you thought you knew about reality. You're going to witness battles fought with forces that reshape space and time. You're going to feel the weight of cosmic powers pressing against your minds. But through it all, remember that you are under my protection and I am under yours. We are humanity, and we do not abandon our own." As if summoned by her words, a new presence made itself known at the edge of perception. It was vast and alien and utterly hostile, probing the dimensional barriers around Thornwick with tendrils of pure entropy. The void touch had found them, and they were coming. The installation's warning systems flared to life, filling the air with harmonics that made every human present instinctively straighten their spines and clench their fists. This was it, the moment when everything would be tested. Lyra felt the full power of the awakened installation flow through her consciousness, and for the first time since her transformation began, she smiled. The void touched had consumed 17 civilizations, but they had never faced a guardian backed by the full resources of an Earth installation, defended by refugees who carried the best of humanity within them, and supported by ordinary people who had decided that some things were worth fighting for. "Let them come," she whispered, her words carrying clearly across the valley despite their softness. "We are ready." The battle for humanity's soul was about to begin. They came with the falling darkness, emerging from tears in reality itself like nightmares given form. The void touched were not creatures in any sense that human minds could easily comprehend. They were absences given shape, living contradictions that existed by denying the existence of everything else. Lyra felt them long before they became visible, a wrongness pressing against the dimensional barriers around Thornwick like infection pressing against healthy tissue. The installation's sensors painted their approach in cascades of data that flowed through her consciousness, each reading more disturbing than the last. 3 primary entities, she reported to Commander Nash, her voice tight with concentration as she processed the incoming information. Each one roughly the size of your ship, accompanied by smaller parasitic forms. Estimated total mass. She paused, the numbers almost too large to believe. Estimated total mass equivalent to a small moon. Nash's face went pale. In all our encounters with them, we never faced anything larger than city-sized entities. They've been feeding, Lyra said grimly, growing stronger with each civilization they consume. But that also means they have more to lose if we can find a way to hurt them. The first visible sign of the enemy's arrival was the stars beginning to dim. Not fade naturally, as they would behind clouds or atmospheric distortion, but actually lose their light as if something was eating the photons before they could reach human eyes. The effect spread across the sky like a stain, creating patches of absolute darkness that hurt to look at directly. Then, the temperature began to drop, not from any natural cause, but from the presence of entities that existed at temperatures approaching absolute zero. Frost began forming on the installation's newly emerged structures despite the season, and the breath of every person in the valley became visible as clouds of vapor. "Remember what I told you?" Lyra called out to the assembled refugees and villagers, her voice carrying clearly despite the growing atmospheric disturbance. "Hold on to your memories, your connections to each other, your sense of who you are. That's your armor against what's coming." The villagers had arranged themselves in family groups, with the strongest adults forming protective circles around children and elderly. The refugees from the Prometheus had integrated seamlessly with the locals, their advanced knowledge of void touch tactics helping to organize defenses, while their deep appreciation for planetary-bound life gave them fierce motivation to protect their new home. Elder Tom Min approached Lyra as she stood at the primary control interface that had emerged near the largest standing stone. His weathered hands shook slightly, but his voice was steady. "Guardian," he said quietly, "there's something you should know about our village, about why your parents might have chosen to come here." Lyra spared him a quick glance while maintaining her connection to the installation systems. "What is it?" "The stories our grandparents told," Tom Min said, his words coming faster as the sky grew darker. "About the times before, when the stones would glow and strange lights danced in the forest. We always thought they were legends, but what if they weren't? What if Thornwick has been a guardian waypoint for longer than anyone remembered?" The implications of that statement hit Lyra like a physical blow. If Thornwick had been an active waypoint in the past, then the village's inhabitants might carry genetic markers that would make them more compatible with guardian technologies than ordinary humans. That would explain their instinctive trust in her, their willingness to stand against the impossible, their, "Oh," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. "Oh, you magnificent, stubborn people." She quickly ran a genetic scan using the installation sensors, sweeping across every human in the valley. The results were astonishing. Nearly 40% of Thornwick's original population carried dormant guardian genetic markers. Not enough to make them full guardians, but sufficient to give them enhanced resistance to psychic attacks and limited compatibility with ancient technologies. "You're not just villagers," she told Tom Min, wonder in her voice. "You're the descendants of guardian support staff, the people who stayed behind to maintain the waypoints while others went to the stars." That's why you never really feared me. Why you're all still here instead of running. Some part of you remembers what you used to be. Before Tom In could respond, the first direct attack began. It wasn't a physical assault in any conventional sense. Instead, reality itself began to fray at the edges. Colors bled from objects like paint running in rain. Sounds became disconnected from their sources, creating an eerie symphony of effects without causes. Gravity fluctuated wildly, making everyone feel alternately lighter than air and heavy as stone. But the true attack was against memory and meaning. The void touched were trying to make the defenders forget why they were fighting, forget who they were protecting, forget that resistance was even possible. Lyra felt the assault like acid against her consciousness, tendrils of pure negation probing for weaknesses in her sense of self. The installation's defenses responded automatically, generating fields of coherent reality that pushed back against the encroaching chaos. But the real resistance came from the people themselves. Instead of succumbing to the existential assault, they began to sing. It started with one of the refugee children, a girl no more than 8 years old who had been born aboard the Prometheus and had never known any home but the ship's corridors. She began with a simple lullaby that her mother had taught her, a song about stars and dreams and the promise of better days ahead. Others joined in, adding their own songs, their own memories made audible. The villagers contributed ancient folk tunes that spoke of harvest festivals and wedding celebrations, of love that endured through hardship and hope that survived the darkest winters. The refugees shared melodies from 17 different worlds, each one a defiant declaration that their civilizations had existed, had mattered, had left something beautiful behind. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Where the songs reached, the reality distortions began to stabilize. The meaninglessness that the void touch projected was met and countered by meanings so dense, so rich with human experience, that it acted like armor against the attack. Impossible, Commander Nash whispered, watching as the singing crowds pushed back effects that had destroyed entire star fleets. They're actually working. Lyra smiled fiercely, her consciousness split between directing the installation's technological defenses and drawing strength from the chorus of human voices around her. They're not just singing, she said. They're remembering together, creating a collective memory so strong that even the void touched can't erase it. But the enemy was adapting. Sensing that their usual tactics were ineffective, the void touched began a more direct approach. The tiers in reality widened, and through them came smaller entities, scouts, and warriors designed for close combat rather than existential warfare. These creatures were easier for human minds to process, though no less terrifying for their comprehensibility. They looked like shadows given solidity, moving with liquid grace that defied physics, and striking with appendages that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Physical defenses online, Lyra announced, her voice now carrying harmonics generated by the installation's communication arrays. All non-combatants to the center of the village. Defensive positions now. The installation's weapon systems opened fire with beams of pure coherent energy that turned night into day. Ancient particle cannons emerged from hidden positions and began systematically targeting the incoming entities, while force barriers flickered into existence around key positions. But it was the human defenders that truly impressed. The refugees from the Prometheus had lived with the threat of void-touched attacks for generations, and their response was swift and coordinated. They formed defensive lines using weapons that seemed to be made of crystallized light, while the villagers supported them with tools that the Awakening installation had provided, implements that channeled human will and determination into tangible force. Elder Tommen, moving with the spryness of a man half his age, wielded what looked like a farming tool, but glowed with the same energy as the Guardian technologies. Marina the baker fought alongside her husband, using weapons that fired compressed memories, literally shooting the enemy with crystallized moments of joy, love, and hope. They're learning, Nash observed, referring to the villagers. The genetic markers are allowing them to interface with Guardian combat systems as if they've been trained for years. More than that, Lyra replied, watching as young Henrik the Constable coordinated a flanking maneuver that would have impressed seasoned military tacticians. They're remembering, not just intellectually, but in their bones, in their blood. Their ancestors were warriors once, guardians of the human spirit. That knowledge never really left them. The battle raged through the night, a clash between forces that represented fundamentally opposite views of existence. The Void Touch sought to reduce everything to empty silence, while the human defenders fought to preserve the complex, chaotic, beautiful tapestry of conscious experience. As dawn approached, it became clear that the defenders were holding their own. The smaller entities had been driven back or destroyed, and even the larger Void Touched had been forced to maintain distance from the installation's increasingly powerful defensive fields. But Lyra could feel something building in her enhanced senses, a gathering of power that spoke of desperation and rage. The enemy was preparing for a final assault, one that would commit all of their remaining strength to breaching the defenses around Thornwick. They're going to try something big, she warned Nash and the other commanders. Everything they have left focused on a single, overwhelming attack. Can we stop it? Nash asked. Lyra considered the question, running probability calculations through the installation's tactical computers while simultaneously monitoring the emotional and spiritual strength of the human defenders. The mathematics were not encouraging. The enemy had enough raw power to potentially overwhelm even the ancient Earth defenses. But there was one factor that the calculations couldn't account for, one element that existed outside the realm of mere physics and energy. Maybe, she said slowly, a plan forming in her mind. But it's going to require something that's never been attempted before. I'm going to need to link every human consciousness in the valley into a single network, creating a collective guardian mind powerful enough to match the Void Touch directly. Nash's eyes widened. The strain alone could kill everyone involved. The alternative is losing everything they've fought to preserve, Lyra replied simply. And I have a feeling that if given the choice, these people will choose to burn brightly rather than fade quietly. She was right. When she explained the plan to the assembled defenders, not a single person chose to leave. Villagers who had never traveled beyond the next valley stood alongside refugees who had crossed the galaxy, all of them united in their determination to face whatever came next. The final battle was about to begin, and it would be fought not just with weapons and energy, but with the collective will of humanity itself. The linking process began at first light, when the Void-touched entities gathered their power for what both sides knew would be the final assault. Lyra stood at the center of the stone circle, her hands pressed against the primary control interface, while streams of energy flowed between her and every human soul in the valley. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced, even during her awakening as a guardian. Instead of her consciousness expanding outward, she felt other minds joining with hers, creating a composite intelligence that was simultaneously one person and thousands. She was Lyra Ashwood, the cursed woman of Thornwick, and she was also every refugee child dreaming of a home they had never seen, every village elder carrying decades of wisdom, every warrior bearing scars from impossible battles. The first person to successfully link was Elder Tom Min, his weathered face serene as his consciousness merged with the growing network. Through his eyes, Lyra experienced decades of quiet strength, of choices made not for glory, but for the simple belief that someone had to stand guard while others slept. "I remember now," he said, though his voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. "My great-grandmother used to tell stories about the guardian who came before, about the night the stones sang, and the forest itself fought against the dark. She said someday, when the need was great enough, they would sing again." Marina the baker joined next, bringing with her memories of feeding others, of creating nourishment and comfort from simple ingredients. Her consciousness added layers of nurturing strength to the collective, the kind of power that came from choosing to care for others, even when resources were scarce. One by one, the villagers linked into the growing network. Each connection brought new dimensions to the collective awareness. Henrik's sense of duty and justice, the blacksmith's knowledge of creating order from raw materials, children's perspectives unmarked by cynicism or despair. The refugees added their own elements, technical knowledge gained through generations of survival, stories from 17 different worlds, and the deep appreciation for life that came from having nearly lost it. But it was Commander Nash's connection that transformed the network from a simple joining of minds into something approaching a true guardian consciousness. As her awareness merged with Lyra's, she brought with her the tactical experience of fighting void-touched entities across multiple star systems, the accumulated wisdom of humanity's scatter colonies, and, most importantly, the understanding of what they were truly fighting to preserve. We are the archive. Nash's thoughts flowed through the network, and every connected mind felt the truth of it. Not just of human civilization, but of everything that consciousness can create when it chooses growth over entropy, creation over destruction, hope over despair. Through the collective awareness, Lyra could perceive the void-touched entities with a clarity that her individual mind could never have achieved. They were revealed not as incomprehensible aliens, but as the logical endpoint of consciousness that had given up on growth, minds that had chosen the certainty of nothingness over the chaos and pain that came with existence. They had once been biological entities, she realized. Millions of years ago, they had faced some cosmic catastrophe that made the choice between struggle and surrender. They had chosen surrender, allowing themselves to be absorbed into a collective unconsciousness that offered peace at the cost of ever-changing, ever-growing, ever becoming anything more than what they already were. But consciousness, once awakened, could not simply return to sleep. Instead of achieving the peace they sought, they had become eternal prisoners of their own choice, existing in a state of perpetual hunger for the growth and change they had rejected. They consumed other civilizations not out of malevolence, but out of a desperate need to experience, even briefly, the life they had voluntarily surrendered. They're not evil, Lyra broadcast through the network, her understanding shifting the collective perception of their enemy. They're tragic. They made the same choice we're making now, but in the opposite direction. Does that change what we have to do? Asked Henrik's mental voice, and the question carried the weight of absolute moral clarity that came from a life spent protecting others. No, Lyra replied, and the certainty of it resonated through every linked consciousness. Because our choice is not just for ourselves. It's for every civilization that will come after us, every species that will someday look up at the stars and wonder what's possible. If we surrender to preserve our own peace, we condemn them to face this choice alone. The void-touched entities began their final assault as the collective guardian consciousness reached full integration. They came not with the reality-warping attacks of the previous night, but with something far more dangerous, a direct assault on the meaning that held the defenders' minds together. It was not an attack that could be blocked by energy shields or deflected by particle beams. Instead, it was a fundamental challenge to the basic assumptions that made existence worthwhile. Why struggle when peace was available? Why accept the pain of growth when stagnation offered comfort? Why choose the uncertainty of hope when despair provided clarity? The questions hit the collective consciousness like hammer blows, each one designed to fracture the bonds holding the network together. Several villagers wavered, their connections weakening as doubt crept into their minds. Even some of the refugees, hardened by decades of conflict, felt their resolve beginning to crack under the existential pressure. But the network held, and Lyra understood why. It wasn't because the humans were stronger or more determined than the entities that had once made the opposite choice. It was because they had something the void-touched had lost when they chose surrender. They had each other. Every doubt that arose in one mind was answered by certainty from another. Every moment of despair was met with memories of joy from across the network. When Henrik began to question whether their struggle was worth the cost, Marina's consciousness surrounded his with the warmth of every meal she had prepared for others, every small act of care that had made life meaningful. When one of the refugee children felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they faced, Elder Tommen's awareness wrapped around hers with decades of quiet courage, showing her that strength came not from the absence of fear, but from the choice to act despite it. This is why we spread to the stars. Commander Nash's thoughts flowed through the network with crystalline clarity. Not to escape each other, but to ensure that no matter what happened, somewhere in the universe, humans would still be choosing connection over isolation, growth over stagnation, hope over despair. The realization triggered something unprecedented in Guardian history. Instead of simply defending against the void-touched assault, the collective consciousness began to project its own influence outward, offering the enemy something they had not experienced in millions of years, a choice to change. Through the network, Lyra reached out to the largest of the void-touched entities, opening a communication channel that bypassed language and spoke directly from consciousness to consciousness. "We know what you were," she broadcast, and Her words carried the accumulated compassion of every human mind in the network. We know the choice you made, and we understand why you made it. But that choice is not permanent. Consciousness can always choose to grow again, to accept uncertainty in exchange for possibility. The response was immediate and violent, a psychic scream of rage and denial that should have shattered the human network like glass. But instead of breaking under the assault, the collective consciousness absorbed it, transforming the pain and anger into something else entirely. Look, Lyra continued, her mental voice carrying images drawn from the memories of every linked mind. Look at what existence can be when consciousness chooses to embrace rather than reject, to create rather than consume. She showed them Marina baking bread in the early morning darkness, not because she had to, but because she knew others would be hungry when they woke. She shared Henrik's memories of standing watch through long nights, protecting people who would never know his name. She revealed Elder Tommen's lifetime of small kindnesses, each one a choice to make the world slightly better than he had found it. From her refugees, she drew images of humans who had traveled impossible distances not to conquer or claim, but simply because they believed others might need help. She showed them children born in the darkness between stars who still played games and told stories and dreamed of better tomorrows. She revealed the depth of love that could exist between beings who chose to care for each other despite knowing that pain and loss were inevitable. This is what you lost, she told the void-touched entities, and her words carried not accusation but invitation. This is what you can choose to find again. For a moment that lasted an eternity, the assault paused. Through the communication channel, Lyra felt something she had not expected from entities of pure entropy, longing. Deep beneath layers of rage and hunger and the desperate need to consume, she sensed the faint echo of what they had once been, the shadow of consciousness that still remembered what it felt like to hope. But the moment passed. The void touched had made their choice too long ago, had invested too much of themselves in the certainty of emptiness. To change now would mean admitting that millions of years of existence have been wasted, that countless civilizations have been destroyed for nothing. The assault resumed with doubled intensity, but something fundamental had changed. The void-touched were no longer attacking from a position of absolute certainty. They were fighting now from fear. Fear that the humans might be right, fear that there might have been another way, fear that their choice had been wrong. And fear, unlike despair, could be overcome. The collective guardian consciousness pressed its advantage, not with weapons or energy, but with the irresistible force of growth itself. The network began to expand, reaching out beyond the valley, beyond Earth, following the ancient communication networks that connected every human settlement across the galaxy. Other Guardian installations began to wake in response to the signal, their systems coming online after millennia of dormancy. Colony worlds that had lost contact with Earth generations ago suddenly found their quantum communicators activating, carrying the same message that Lyra was broadcasting to the void-touched entities. Remember who you are. Remember what you chose to protect. Remember that consciousness can always choose to grow. The effect was extraordinary. Across dozens of star systems, human colonies that had given up hope began to organize resistance movements. Refugee fleets that had been hiding in interstellar space turned toward Earth, following the beacon signals that were now pouring from every active Guardian installation. Even humans who had been captured by the void-touched and partially absorbed began to assert their independence, their individual consciousnesses strengthened by connection to the growing network. My God, Nash whispered through the link. Her awareness expanded to encompass the scope of what was happening. They're all waking up. Every human settlement, every colony ship, every Guardian installation that still has power. The entire network is coming back online. The void-touched entities recoiled from the expanding wave of consciousness, their forms beginning to lose cohesion as the certainty that had sustained them for millennia began to crack. They had conquered 17 human civilizations by attacking them individually, overwhelming each one before they could organize effective resistance. But they had never faced humanity as a truly united force, all of them connected by the shared choice to embrace existence rather than reject it. We offer you the same choice we've made, Lyra broadcast one final time, her mental voice now carrying the weight of every human consciousness in the galaxy. Stop trying to force others to join you in emptiness, and We will help you find your way back to fullness. Choose growth over stagnation, and we will teach you how to bear the pain that comes with change. The largest of the void-touched entities hung motionless in space above Thornwick, its form flickering between existence and absence as it struggled with a decision it had thought it would never have to make again. Then, slowly it began to pull back, not in retreat, but in something that might have been acceptance. The psychic assault ceased, the reality distortions faded, and for the first time in millions of years, a void-touched entity chose to stop consuming and start considering what it might become instead. The other entities followed suit, withdrawing to the edges of the solar system where they hung in space like dark stars, no longer attacking, but not yet ready to embrace the change that had been offered to them. Through the collective consciousness, Lyra felt the celebration that erupted across the galaxy as human colonies realized they were no longer alone, no longer facing inevitable extinction. But she also felt something else, responsibility. The Guardian Network was active again, and with it came the duty to help not just humanity, but any species that made the choice to embrace consciousness over oblivion. As the sun reached its zenith over Thornwick, Lyra began the delicate process of separating individual consciousnesses from the collective network while maintaining the connections that would allow rapid reunification if needed. One by one, the villagers and refugees returned to their individual awareness, though they carried with them the memory of what it felt like to be part of something larger than themselves. "What happens now?" Elder Tommen asked, his voice tired but filled with quiet satisfaction. Lyra looked around at the transformed valley, at the humans from 17 different worlds who had become neighbors and family in the space of a few days, at the ancient technologies that hummed with renewed purpose, and at the sky where other ships were already beginning to appear as the scattered children of Earth followed the beacon home. "Now," she said, her voice carrying the authority of Guardian but also the warmth of a young woman who had finally found her place in the universe. "We do what humans have always done. We help each other. We grow. We explore. We stand guard against the darkness. And we never forget that the choice to exist, to grow, to hope is the most beautiful and terrible and necessary choice that consciousness can make." She smiled then, the first completely happy expression she had worn since childhood. "And maybe," she added, looking up at where the void-touched entities waited at the edge of space, "we help them remember how to make that choice too." The curse that had marked her as different had become the gift that united a galaxy. The woman who had been cast out for speaking in forgotten tongues had become the voice that called humanity home. And in the village of Thornwick, where ancient stones marked the boundaries between worlds, the real work of building tomorrow began.